Alright, now I want to talk a little bit about absolute value. And to do that, I'm going to first draw a number line, and I'll use the number line to describe what's going on when we're talking about absolute value. So let's just draw some lines here. And I'm going to say this is -2, -1, 0, +1, +2. Okay, now absolute value is really what it's asking you is the distance from that number that we're looking at to 0. And so if I were looking at, say, -2, and I wanted to know the absolute value of -2, what I'm really saying or asking is how many spaces, or what's the distance from this -2 to 0. And I could just count on the number line here. I can go 1, 2. So the absolute value of -2 is going to be 2. Now the way we write this is we're going to use these symbols, or these grouping symbols that look like this. They're long straight lines, and then we're going to put our number that we're trying to find the absolute value for. So I want to know the absolute value of -2, and that's what this would look like here. And our answer to that would be 2, because the distance from -2 to 0 is going to be 2. This is 1, this is 1, 1 and 1 is 2. Same thing for the absolute value of -1. Say we're here, and we want to know the distance, or the absolute value, from -1 to 0. And we know that's going to be 1. So we would write this as the absolute value of 1, and we're going to use these long straight lines that kind of encase that number, and then we know that to be 1. Now let's look at some other types of absolute value problems. Say we want to find the absolute value of 2. Okay, so again I would write it like this. Okay, and again I'm looking, what is the distance from 2 to 0? 1, 2. +2. We could do the same thing for 1. You know, the absolute value of +1 is going to be 1, because 1 to 0 is just 1. Now I want you to take note that the answers for all of these problems happen to be positive numbers. And that's going to be the case for these absolute problems, absolute value problems. When you're taking the absolute value of either a negative or a positive number, your answer is going to be a positive number. Now let's go ahead and talk about operations with absolute value. And I'm only going to give you a couple of simple problems. When we get into add, subtract, multiply, and divide with integers, then we'll throw in some challenging absolute problems. But for this video, let's just focus on some basics. So you might have a problem that looks like this. And it could be true for any of the operations, add, subtract, multiply, divide, where you have an operation within the absolute value grouping symbols. If you remember, with order of operations, you want to figure out what's inside the grouping symbols before you do anything else. And so these straight lines that indicate that it's absolute value are kind of like parentheses when you were working with order of operation problems. So before we can take the absolute value of 5 plus 7, we have to evaluate 5 plus 7. And so 5 plus 7 is 12. And so now we're going to take the absolute value of 12. And remember, we're asking what's the distance from 12 to 0, and that's going to be 12. Let's try another one. Let's say we have 16, or the absolute value of 16 divided by 4. Okay? Again, we want to do the division first within the absolute value symbols, and then we'll find the absolute value. 16 divided by 4 is 4, so we're taking the absolute value of 4, and that's going to give us 4. Let's do one more. Let's say we have the absolute value of 5 times 2, and then we're going to add to that 3. Again, we want to figure out this part first, find the absolute value, and then add 3. 5 times 2 is 10, so absolute value of 10 plus 3. Absolute value of 10 is 10 plus 3 is 13. Now let's go ahead and do one more type of problem that you're likely to see. You might have a negative absolute value. So the negative sign is going to be on the outside, and then your absolute value will be written. So say we have 1. Again, what we want to do is find the absolute value and then bring down whatever else is left. So the absolute value of 1 is 1. Now this is a positive 1, but I'm going to bring down this negative sign. This is basically saying the opposite of the absolute value of 1, which happens to be negative 1. Let's do another one. Let's say we have the opposite of 3, or the absolute value of 3. So the absolute value of 3 is going to be 3, but the opposite of positive 3 is negative 3. So essentially we're bringing down that negative. Opposite and negative kind of have similar connotations. Now sometimes we have the opposite of the absolute value of a negative number. So say we have the opposite absolute value of negative 4. Again, we want to evaluate this part first before we deal with that. So the absolute value of negative 4 is 4. And the opposite of, the opposite of positive 4 is negative 4. Now sometimes we will have a series of negatives within parentheses. And so let me write down an example for you. Say we have negative 2. Okay, here we go. So we have the opposite of the absolute value of negative 2. And that sounds and there might be a better way to say that, but that looks like what it is. Maybe another way is the negative of a negative absolute value of negative 2. That might be a better way to say it. Anyway, like order of operations, we're going to work on the inside first and work our way out. So the absolute value of negative 2 is going to be 2. Now, the opposite of positive 2 is going to be negative 2. And then I'm just going to bring this down. So now we have the opposite of negative 2. Well, the opposite of negative 2 is a positive 2. And when we talk more about multiplying with integers, another way you can see this as is negative 1 times negative 2 will give us a positive 2. Anyway, these are just some examples of some different kinds of absolute value problems that you might run across. So just keep a heads up and ask questions in class if you're not sure.